Herzlich willkommen.
Dear viewers, dear listeners, welcome to our program for today, Soul Murder Under the Abuse of the Name of Christ. This first part deals with the eradication of the North American Indians. When Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean in 1492, an estimated 18 million indigenous inhabitants lived in the northern part of the newly discovered continent. That is, on the area of the present-day United States and Canada. Until today, they are called Indians because Columbus erroneously thought he had landed in India. 400 years after Columbus, in 1890, about 250,000 so-called Indians lived in the same area. That's between 1 and 2% of the original number of indigenous people. Today, more than 100 years later, approximately 3 million people with exclusively Indian roots live in the United States and Canada. However, most of them have been pushed back into living on meager reservations. Many suffer from poverty, alcoholism, or drug abuse. The unemployment rate is 50%. The suicide rate is high, and their life expectancy is only about 60 years. So what happened to all the formerly so self-confident natives? And why are there only so few? They were driven out, deported, humiliated, their culture robbed and murdered in a merciless 2.5 centuries-long war. One can truly speak of genocide, says Martin Klepper, professor of American culture history at Humboldt University in Berlin. Present-day Indians also speak very clearly of a genocide committed on their ancestors.
And this genocide, which dragged on over 250 years, one of the longest in the history of humankind, was committed by people who called themselves Christian. That is, who referred to Jesus the Christ, the Prince of Peace, who taught the love of neighbor and forgiveness, even love of enemy, and who said in his Sermon on the Mount, "Do to others as you would have them do to you." We also know this golden rule, spoken a little differently: do not do to others what you do not want done to you. How was it possible that people who called themselves Christian drove their fellow human beings from their ancestral land, burned down their villages, intentionally infected them with epidemics, let them starve in the desert, randomly shot men, women and children, and committed many other atrocities? And that not only for years or decades, but for centuries. Of course, this concerns not only the historical events of the last 500 years in North America, that is, in the USA and Canada. This question equally concerns Latin America, from Mexico to Tierra del Fuego, which we'll report about in another program.
In contrast to Latin America, where the Spanish conquistadors met in part thoroughly organized advanced civilizations such as the Maya or the Aztecs, in North America, more than 500 totally differing tribes lived on a huge area with totally different languages and tribal cultures. The Indians felt nature as having a soul, as a living being, writes Karl-Heinz Deschner in his book, The Moloch. They felt at one with it, related to the animals and trees, and everything belonged to everyone. Everything was a part of a common mother, from whom one did live, certainly, but moderately, who one spared, and also protected. They were gatherers and hunters, but they gathered and hunted only what was necessary. And they did not know the crass social differences of the so-called Christians. It's true that the Indians led wars with one another, but the sense of community that the Indians displayed was sometimes astonishing, according to Deschner. To support one another in illness, that was, for instance, particularly important after the arrival of the Europeans, because they brought numerous pathogens with them against which the Native Americans had no resistance. Whole tribes, especially in the south of the USA, were wiped out with epidemics such as smallpox, typhus, and cholera.
The first encounters of the new arrivals with the indigenous inhabitants were still mostly peaceful. The Indians were mostly cautious and reserved, often even welcoming and helpful. Morally, writes Karl-Heinz Deschner, the savages, in quotation marks, were all in all far superior to the white men. During the initial years in foreign surroundings, the European new settlers fought to survive and were dependent on help. In part, the Indians even helped them with food supplies, told them how to grow corn, or traded with the settlers. But that did not last. More and more settlers crossed the ocean and claimed land for themselves. Soon the first clashes began, the first fights, and also the first massacre of natives by the Europeans. Thus, as Karl-Heinz Deschner reports, in 1643, the Dutch General Director of the West India Company had hundreds of peacefully living Algonquin Indians throttled in their sleep and all kinds of hacked-off heads brought in. High-ranking representatives of the same company confessed afterward, "The Indians lived among us like sheep. They did everything humanly possible for us and gave us food when our supplies ran out." But through his despicable behavior, the director turned the Indians against us, so that it is impossible to predict how peace could be restored. The murderers who destroyed the peace called themselves Christians, and Christ is the Prince of Peace, who, as Jesus of Nazareth, lived on this earth totally without violence, and said to his disciples, "Put your sword back in its place, for the one who takes up the sword will perish by the sword."
What would have happened if the new settlers had actually been Christians and not only a name? If they had taken to heart and lived the commandment of love for God and neighbor? How would the country look today? And how would things be today for the descendants of the Indians of that time? Millions of people would have stayed alive, and possibly a peaceful coexistence in mutual respect and esteem could have developed between the settlers and natives. Instead, the Europeans waged a shameful, violent, and utterly unchristian expedition of conquest. Those murdered died, however, in the belief that their murderers were Christians. And who knows how many of the souls of those murdered still believe until today that Christ, whose name the white men uttered, is responsible for their cruel fate, as well as the God, whom Jesus of Nazareth taught us, and to whom the white men wrongly referred. But it was not Christ, our divine brother and Redeemer, who had the Native Americans tortured and killed. It was the people who wrongly referred to him, the Prince of Peace, and who, however, in reality did the opposite of what Jesus the Christ taught and lived as an example. And that is why we have to talk about soul murder here. The conquerors from Europe were people in whom, as Deschner writes, the old Europe was ingrained. Its feudalism, its wars, its military duty, its torture. But let's pursue the question, who made the old continent Europe so warlike, so brutal, so unequal, who invented feudalism and supported it for centuries? That was the church institutions, who had imprinted the old continent right into its deepest pores, and all that in the name of God.
Among the first settlers were numerous deeply religious people, not to say fanatically religious people, and they in particular are revered until today as the first Pilgrim Fathers. In November 1620, 120 men, women and children landed on the coast of Massachusetts on the ship called the Mayflower. They were Puritans of a particularly strict Protestant Calvinistic direction of faith. The purpose of this group was markedly religious. The Puritans viewed themselves as a chosen people, as instruments of divine providence. They wanted to perfect the Reformation and to be an example for the world, and they oriented themselves to the Bible. But the Bible is not the Word of God in all its parts. It originated from the most varying authors. On the one hand, we find in it texts that until today are precedent-setting for the entire history of humankind, such as the Ten Commandments of God through his prophet Moses, or the Sermon on the Mount of Jesus of Nazareth. But on the other hand, we also find countless falsifications and insertions, which the priests of the respective eras wrote, and which have not the slightest thing to do with God, the Eternal, and with Christ, the co-regent of the heavens. For example, the claim that God is a punishing God, who even ordered genocide and the death penalty, or that it is supposedly God's will that priests, whom He, the Eternal, never instituted, should cruelly kill animals, then bring them to Him, the God of love, as offerings. Such horrible regulations regarding offerings did not come from God, but from the priests.
And so the question always is, what does a person single out, and with what content does he fill it? Luther and Calvin, on whose writings the conquerors of this part of the continent based their larger and smaller prayer circles, did not, however, emphasize in their doctrines the Sermon on the Mount of Jesus of Nazareth, with its teaching of love for neighbor and enemy. Instead, they placed more value on the passages in the Bible in which the punishing God is spoken of, as you said, as well as violence and manslaughter, which in part was allegedly ordered by God. The already mentioned scenes of genocide in the Bible later became a terrible role model for the genocide of the Indians. And the murder of the Indians was supposed to have evoked God's favor in a similar way as formerly the murder of the animals to be sacrificed in the temple. In contrast to the pacifism of Jesus, Luther, as well as Calvin, whose spirit shaped European Protestantism, justifies violence and war and also the persecution of dissidents. Martin Luther, for example, called for the massacre of the peasants who had rebelled against the oppression of the princes. And he added, "Such strange times are here that a people can win heaven more easily by the shedding of blood rather than others by prayers." Such glorification of violence also helped shape European Protestantism, and that is exactly what the Indians would come later to feel. John Calvin not only set up a fanatical dictatorship in Geneva, he also had religious dissidents killed in horrible ways.
Auge Auge, Zahn Zahn.
An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. These words from the Old Testament in the Bible were read again and again by the priestly-inspired warlike conquerors of all times as a call to manslaughter, and they could always find or construct a reason to strike out. In contrast, God's prophet Isaiah announced peaceableness, peace between human being, nature, and the animals, because the Spirit of God is present in everything. It is the great unity of creation which results in the respect for all life forms, which the Indians doubtlessly felt much more than their tormentors. On the other hand, such thoughts from the divine world played hardly a role for the reformers and their European and American followers. They would have merely disturbed the new lords of the land in exterminating nearly all the buffaloes on the North American prairie in the shortest time. With this, they deprived the Indians living there of their basis for existence, while at the same time making room for the huge cattle herds of the new settlers that were destined for the slaughterhouses in Chicago.
The disastrous legacy that the reformers sent along with their followers into the New World included not only justification for war and violence, the denigration of nature and animals, it also included the fear of an allegedly punishing God. Luther, as well as Calvin, denied people any kind of free will. They taught so-called predestination. It says that God has supposedly predestined some people to a life according to His will, and others to eternal hell, and at that, even before they are born. That has not the slightest thing to do with the teaching of Jesus the Christ. But in such a religion, how are people thought of who don't even believe in the God of the churches, who are thus so-called heathens? William Bradford, one of the participants in the Mayflower expedition, reported that many Puritans thought of America as, and I quote, one of those vast and unpeopled countries which are fruitful and fit for habitation, being devoid of all civilized inhabitants, where there are only savage and brutish men. Jesus of Nazareth spoke of His and our Father as the God of love, and He said, "Come all to me who labor and are heavy laden. I want to give you rest." Thus He, the Redeemer of all souls and ensouled people, did not make differences, because also God, the Eternal, loves all His children without exception. He is here for all people, and His Spirit is also active in His whole creation and in all animals.
On the other hand, priests and theologians often do make differences, thus forming images of an enemy. And they then transmit this wrong attitude to their faithful, and that over generations. These are important aspects of the religious background on which the genocide of the Indians took place. The settlers of the Mayflower are here only one example of many, even though a characteristic one. In the initial years, the Puritan settlers were still dependent on help from the Indians, so as to survive under adverse conditions, but that changed. In the German daily newspaper, the Main Echo, the journalist Thomas Burmeister writes, in 1637, Puritans, who just a few decades earlier had found a new home on Massachusetts Bay in North America, thought that they might need more land. They suddenly declared that the Pequot Indians, who had lived there since time immemorial, were children of Satan and called for a holy war. Rarely has a people been so thoroughly eradicated by overly superior enemies as the Pequot by the Bible fanatical English immigrants. One of the so-called Pilgrim Fathers, the aforementioned William Bradford, wrote about the massacre, and here I quote from the book In the Name of God by Karen Armstrong. Those who escaped the fire were slain with the sword. Some were hewed to pieces, others run through with rapiers, so they were quickly dispatched, and only few escaped. It was conceived they destroyed about 400 at this time. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and also the streams of blood quenching the same. And horrible was the stink and scent thereof, but the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the prayers thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them.
It's really incredible. Here, Karl-Heinz Deschner quotes the anthropologist Paul Radin, who wrote, "They first fell on their knee, and then they fell over the natives." And the theologians supplied the accompanying music. Deschner writes, "And so now, too, especially, the clergy incited the manhunt, who called their victims the barbaric, unbelieving Indians, scum of humankind, filth and dregs, monsters without faith, and their religion pure Satanism." And so, the people who set out to build a better world raged and murdered. But the promises of a new Christian world did not apply to America's indigenous people, writes Barbara Jentz in the weekly newspaper Freitag. The Puritans had, thus once more Karen Armstrong, no pangs of conscience at all when they killed Indians. So the puritanical preacher Alexander Layton said that God is a great warrior and that the Bible is the best textbook of war. And the pastor, John Compton, taught that they could also attack the natives without being provoked, because they not only had the natural right to the territory, but even a mission from God to take the land away from them. And that was not only the opinion of the Puritans, but also of the numerous other Protestant groups, which thus began in North America to take possession of ever more land and to displace the natives.
When it became clear to the Indians that the newcomers were in the process of destroying their basis of existence, of occupying their vegetable gardens and hunting territories in order to establish their agricultural monocultures there, some of them staged an uprising in March 1622. The Virginia Company, the financial backer of the settlers in Virginia, which belonged to the Anglican Church, thereupon gave in return the instruction to its colonists to take possession of all land and to eradicate all tribes involved. Destroy those who sought to destroy us, was said in the statement. The journalist Wolf Schneider writes, "It's true that the Indians were heathens, whom the Pope ordered the Spaniards to convert to salvation, whom later the Anglican Church ordered the English or the Puritan conscience to do the same, if the savages were human beings at all. One exception among most of the Protestant religious groups that colonized North America were the Quakers, at least in the beginning. They were pacifists and therefore treated with hostility and persecuted by other Protestants in North America. But this exception did not last, even though at the end of the 17th century William Penn had rejected all use of force in his Indian-friendly founding of Pennsylvania and had also worked for Indian rights of ownership. His grandson, the Governor William Penn, set a premium for Indian scalps that led to indiscriminate killings.
In the 18th century, blankets were then distributed to the Indians that were infected with the smallpox virus, because it was, according to the British General Amherst, too bad to send British soldiers against these vermin. They didn't even stop murdering the Indians who had been converted to so-called Christianity. Karl-Heinz Deschner wrote, "When during the Revolutionary War, a group of several hundred converted Indians, praying Indians, were driven from refuge to refuge, finally, near starvation, they returned to a former site in order to fetch the harvest that had been already brought in. 200 white Christians lay in wait for the red Christians. They pretended to be friends, convinced the unfortunate Indians to give up their weapons, and then slaughtered and scalped them, not only the men, but also the old women and 34 children, apparently even Indian women, as a contemporary witness wrote, with a child at the breast." When following this war, after the end of the 18th century, the United States of America had gained its independence. It anchored in its Constitution freedom of religion and the separation of church and state in order to find a common denominator among the many groups and denominations. This was and is a great achievement. However, for more than a century, free citizenship was withheld from the indigenous inhabitants and the slaves from Africa. By the way, slavery, just like the eradication of the Indians, was always based on respectively fitting Bible passages. So it says, for instance, in just one passage of many in the third book of Moses, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 44, "As for the male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from the nations that are round about you."
Allegedly, God, the Eternal, said this through his prophet Moses, one of the many falsifications that the caste of priests brought into this book. And despite the, as stated, precedent setting separation of state and church, Protestantism remained in the background of the prevailing ideology of many politicians. Among these Protestant politicians of the 19th century, an important concept was the term manifest destiny, the destiny of the nation to expand its supposedly divinely ordained influence ever farther. For these politicians, it also played no role that behind this expansion stood avarice, claims of ownership, and the egoism of a predatory capitalism. Or, as the Lutheran theologian and expert on America, Geico Müller-Fahrenholz, phrased it in the Catholic newspaper Public Forum, "If I am an instrument of God, then my methods and deeds are also legitimized by God. If people come to harm thereby, the blame is borne by those who oppose the blessings of my mission." End of quote. Of course, that had nothing at all to do with the will of God. An alleged divine mission in which men, women and children are indiscriminately slaughtered, in which daily anew the love for God and neighbor taught by Jesus the Christ was trampled underfoot for 2.5 centuries, is the opposite of what Christ, the Prince of Peace, taught.
At the instigation of these politicians, the persecution and eradication of the Indians was then carried out systematically and bureaucratically most efficiently during the 19th century. This system included frequently making new contracts with individual tribes, often using pressure and extortion, to then break these contracts one and all. They were offered a certain purchase price, better land, or were guaranteed tolerable living conditions. As good as none of this was fulfilled. Wolf Schneider writes, "If the Indians were human beings, then first of all, heathens, and by far not fellow men. The Europeans kept agreements with them only as long as they felt themselves to be the weaker ones. As soon as they felt strong enough, they tore up every contract. The Indians of North America were not prepared for this. Anyone who had smoked the peace pipe with one another had entered into an obligation that he kept." How very much the inhuman ideology of Protestant origin had taken root in people's heads can also be seen by the fact that, at times, even American presidents let themselves be infected with it. In 1830, the 7th U.S. President, Andrew Jackson, a particularly brutal persecutor of Indians, signed the Indian Removal Act, which empowered him to take all Indians still living in eastern USA and deport them over the Mississippi River to the west, one of the greatest forced displacements in history, as Karl-Heinz Deschner writes. President Jackson was originally meant to become a Protestant pastor, but instead landed in politics in the chaos of war, and after his death, was honored in an obituary as Old Soldier, Patriot, and Christian.
In December 1831, under icy temperatures, the French political philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville witnessed the deportation by ship ordered by Jackson of 15,000 Choctaw Indians who, like 64,000 members of other tribes, had to leave the land on which their ancestors had lived for hundreds of years. Let us allow a few sentences of this to take effect in us. I quote Tocqueville's words as quoted in the German newspaper Die Zeit from July 21, 2011. Not a sound was to be heard and no crying, even though there were small children, old people, and severely ill people among the Choctaws. Only the dogs howled with ear-splitting strength when they realized that their owners would leave them behind. The animals quickly decided to plunge into the icy waters and swam after the steamship. An air of ruin and destruction lay over the whole scene, something which betrayed a final and irrevocable adieu. One couldn't watch without feeling one's heart wrung. A few years later followed the deportation of the Cherokees. Karl-Heinz Deschner writes about this. Military law was introduced against the Cherokees. The army tracked down the Indians with bloodhounds. They arrested them, hung them, fetched the men from the field, the women out of their houses, tore children from their parents. Finally, they hauled 15,000 Cherokees to Arkansas, and thousands died in the process. The soldier Burnett reported that the hunted ones had to walk barefoot through ice and snowstorms, that they died of cold, illness, and maltreatment. I will never forget the silent grief of this morning. Chief John Ross started the prayer, and when the signal was blown, children jumped up and with their little hands waved goodbye to their home mountains, which they would never see again. The trail of the deported was a death march. When the journey ended, 4,000 silent graves marked our path.
The Indian wars towards the middle of the 19th century and thereafter, so continues Deschner, were solely about eradication. The Indians were granted no right to own land. Their villages were burned down. Their herds, harvests, clothing, food destroyed. They drove the last survivors into ever smaller reservations, and then gold panners and settlers also overran them. It was total war. The officer, John Milton Chivington, sneaked with his soldiers in the morning dawn to about 150 huts of the Cheyenne and had 450 people killed, mainly women and children. Chivington was an educated Methodist preacher, and several years previously had been a missionary. After this massacre, he went before the court, accused as a war criminal, but President Lincoln stood behind him, whereupon he was acquitted. Karl-Heinz Deschner wrote, "Only all too often were the massacres condoned or even led by politicians, clergymen, military commanders. They were fanned and defended from the pulpit." And we could add that many a one who committed such a massacre perhaps kept firmly to his Protestant belief that supposedly faith alone is sufficient for salvation, as the Reformer Luther called, "Sin boldly, but believe even more boldly."
Grover Cleveland, who became President of the United States during the last phase of the Indian Wars, grew up as the son of a pastor in a strictly led Calvinist parsonage and expressly represented the Calvinist doctrine of predestination, whereby the fate of every human being is allegedly predetermined. And still in 1890, on the threshold of the 20th century, a last downright massacre was carried out at Wounded Knee. Fleeing women with children in their arms were shot down long after the resistance had stopped and after every warrior already lay dead or dying on the ground. Still in the 20th century, the 32nd President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt, who successively belonged to 3 different Protestant denominations, said, "The most vicious cowboy has more moral principle than the average Indian." And further, "Our great land is not an animal sanctuary for dirty savages." In the 20th century, the genocide had come to an end, but the abysmal contempt and denigration which speaks from these words of Theodore Roosevelt were not yet at an end. Until today, the descendants of the survivors of the consequences of this isolation and marginalization are still suffering. Basically, almost an entire people which never had a real chance to win this agonizingly long fight is still more or less traumatized by the endless horror which lasted for centuries. This is shown by the high rate of suicide and alcoholism among the Indians still living today.
Yes, in addition came new trauma. Even in the 20th century, a whole generation of young Indians underwent a big re-education experiment, mostly in homes run by churches. In numerous ways, they were encouraged or forced to abandon their Native American identities and culture. Many were also maltreated and sexually abused in these mission schools, as numerous Indians affected report. Only in the year 2000 did the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, a department of the U.S. Department of the Interior, apologize for the massacres and crimes that had been committed by his department during the 175 years of its existence. Aside from this apology by one individual, however, we can hardly talk about a true reappraisal or making amends for these horrible events from the side of the religious communities involved. In a lecture at the University of Bielefeld, Germany in 2002, Hans Ulrich Weller, professor of history and philosophy, and one of the best experts on North American intellectual history, traced this back to a lack of self-criticism and to the search for scapegoats, which, as we've seen, have their roots not lastly in the theologians of the Protestant churches.
Liebe Zuschauerinnen, liebe Zuschauer,
Dear viewers, dear listeners, Jesus of Nazareth taught something entirely different. He, the Prince of Peace, said that we should first remove the beam from our own eye, that is, we should recognize and repent of our own wrong behavior before we can help our neighbor to remove the splinter from his eye. He said that we should reconcile with our fellow people as long as we are underway with them. He encouraged us to empathize with all people. What you have done to the least of my brothers, you have done to me. The Indians of today still suffer under the result of a terrible genocide. And what about the souls of the Indians murdered, tortured, betrayed, banished, or left behind in hopeless desolation? And what about the souls of the women raped and of the children who were torn from their parents and brutally beaten? Where are they today? From the revelations of the Spirit of the Christ of God through his prophetess and emissary for the present time, Gabriele, We know that the souls of deceased people continue to live. Mostly they are in the worlds of the beyond until they have cleansed themselves of burdens to the extent that they again return to God, our Father, in the eternally pure heavenly worlds. Or they take upon themselves another incarnation as a human being in order to grow and mature here on the earth. And so, in this connection, the question also arises, what about the souls of the perpetrators who caused the severest suffering? A clearing up of this guilt is possible only through self-recognition, remorse, and asking forgiveness, after a soul, for example, has felt on its own soul body what it did to its neighbor as a human being on the earth, whereby ultimately the victims of the perpetrators also have to forgive them, which is possible in the worlds of the beyond.
Let us try once again to bring to mind the situation of a victim. How does the soul of a person feel who, for instance, suddenly has to die in a cruel way? It's possible that this soul will need a long time in the beyond to forgive the perpetrators and free itself from the images and accusations and continue on its way in the worlds of the beyond, especially if it was left by the murderers in the belief that God, the Eternal, or Christ, His Son, had caused this suffering, because in their blood frenzy, the murderers again and again called out the name of the All-Highest. In 1981, through the prophetic word of the present time, through Gabriella, who has served the Eternal as his speaking instrument for more than 40 years, a law prince before the throne of God gave a comprehensive explanation regarding this subject. I am now privileged to read some sentences from this divine revelation. The Spirit of Jesus Christ blows anew outside of the institution church. At all times, the Spirit of God flowed through the prophets, who primarily appeared outside of the churches. Jesus Christ, the living free Spirit, does not profess to the constricting dogmas, rites, statutes, and also not to the striving for power that has dominated the external churches since the end of early Christianity. His sole call is, "Follow me." The Bible did not bring peace to humankind, neither during the centuries when it was a punishable offense for Christians to read the text in their mother tongue, nor in the present time, in which it is again fanatically represented. The Holy Spirit does not blow anywhere where the Word of God is fanatically represented. The Spirit of God knows no fanaticism, but only a clarification of the causes that are pressing to come into effect.
Further, it says in this revelation, after his resurrection, the Lord kept to his announcement to convey still deeper truth to his own. He taught through prophets and prophetesses in early Christianity and then again during the Middle Ages. He, the Lord, wanted to first instruct his own and then baptize with the Spirit of truth and knowledge, in order to then send them out and to teach the gospel to those who did not believe in him. The Lord did not want to send out any unenlightened people, but enlightened ones. His word applied not only to the apostles, but to all of Christianity. The Christians did go out to make other Christians. However, their basic attitude was not selfless love, but the sword of hatred and the greed for power and prestige. So they cruelly killed and tortured the children of the Lord and thought that they could thus awaken a Christendom. This bloodbath, which they brought about in the name of Christ, has not yet been atoned for. and is therefore present. Until the present time, the church institution has neither given back to the nations the treasures that it robbed from them, nor has it made amends for the terrible events. The hatred of the people killed back then still clings to these souls. These souls, which are found in the purification plains, are striving for revenge. Their drive for retribution is primarily aimed at all those who call themselves Christians and who were accessories to the bloodbath. In the eyes of the revenge-thirsty souls, the crude fellows of a secularized power who called themselves Christians and carried out the bloodbath in the name of Christ and in the name of his redeeming cross are not the murderers, but the Christ of God, in whose name they committed the basest acts.
Dear viewers, dear listeners, He, the Prince of Peace, the Redeemer of all human beings and souls, has nothing at all to do with the atrocities, with the unimaginable crimes that were committed in His name. He gave us people an understanding of the God of love, the All-One, who infinitely loves all of His earthly children, who also loves, and with His Spirit, constantly respirates nature and the animals. As Jesus of Nazareth, He was the spiritual revolutionary who rejected every kind of violence and deceit. Christ, the co-regent of the heavens, also lives with His power in every soul and in every ensouled human being, and is ready at every moment to help and support us so that we may grow closer to God in us. Dear viewers, dear listeners, we have now reached the end of our program. We want to let you know that in a future program we will examine the fate of the indigenous peoples in Central and South America. We take our leave of you for today. Goodbye and greetings in God.
Zu unserem heutigen Thema Frauenquote in Männerkirche.
Dear viewers, dear listeners, welcome to our topic for today, women's quota in men's church. Pope pleads for legally anchored women's quota. That was the headline of the Catholic News Service on June 9, 2017, according to which, at the plenary assembly of the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue, the Pope called for women taking part more in all settings of society. He literally said, therefore, it is a beneficial process, that of having the growing presence of women in social, economic, and political life on the local, national, and international levels, as well as in ecclesial life. And he also proclaimed, women are fully entitled to actively take part in all settings, and their rights must be affirmed and protected, including through legal instruments wherever it may prove necessary. We can be quite astonished by such a report. Does that mean that after over 250 male popes, the next pope will be a woman, a popess? Particularly in filling this office, a women's quota would be mathematically overdue.
In diesem Fall wird es die Zukunft zeigen.
In this case, the future will tell. But according to these socially acceptable words of the Pope, we should be able to assume that he himself will lead the way as a good role model and first of all change his own legal framework and there, too, help women to their rights. In the so-called Codex Juris Canonici of the Vatican Church, also known as canon law, it namely says under number 1024, a baptized male alone receives sacred ordination validly. Here, as in many other places in canon law, it is unmistakably stated that only men can belong to the hierarchy of the Church. That nothing about this can be changed was underlined by Pope John Paul II in his apostolic letter Ordinatio Sacerdotalis from the year 1994. The Pope determined, wherefore, in order that all doubt may be removed regarding a matter of great importance, a matter which pertains to the Church's divine constitution itself, in virtue of my ministry of confirming the brethren, I declare that the Church has no authority whatsoever to confer priestly ordination on women, and that this judgment is to be definitively held by all the Church's faithful. Thus, the doctrinal statement by a former pope.
But then, how honest is the urging of the current pope for equal rights, when the binding doctrine of his own church determines the exclusion of women from all important offices? And doesn't the question also arise, what is now actually valid? That which John Paul II canonized by Pope Francis proclaimed, which categorically and finally excluded women from priestly ordination? Or the words of Francis, who talks about the growing presence of women in ecclesial life?
Falsch ist es auf jeden Fall, wenn man sich für diese Frauen
In any case, it is wrong to refer back to Jesus of Nazareth in terms of these women-despising laws. Valid church opinion is that Jesus of Nazareth called solely men as apostles, and that is why the church cannot ordain women as priests. Actually, it was especially women who stood by Jesus of Nazareth in faithfulness and love right up to his death on the cross. It was Mary Magdalene and another Mary, that is, female disciples of Jesus, to whom the Christ of God first appeared, and who announced the good news of his resurrection to the apostles and disciples. So if women were given the task by Christ himself to announce his resurrection to the disciples, how can the priest men presume to exclude women from teaching positions?
Jesus of Nazareth did not teach the exclusion of women. In every respect, he taught the equality between people. He taught that all people are brothers and sisters, and that no one should put himself above others. Jesus of Nazareth called upon the people to follow him, and told his followers to love one another as he has loved us. Thus, the Catholic contempt of women has nothing to do with Jesus the Christ. It is based on statements in the letters of Paul, and for centuries was celebrated in a particularly derogatory way by many canonized churchmen. At the pinnacle of misogynic statements about women are probably those of the canonized Thomas of Aquinas, who stated, woman is to man like the incomplete and defective is to complete perfection. For him, woman is a monster of nature, a kind of mutilated, failed, abortive man. So what should we think about statements like those of Pope Francis about the rights of women, when such men in his church continue to be venerated as saints? Must not the Pope make clear that the misogynic statements about women by this doctor of the church are wrong? Must he not even decanonize him?
The fact is that Jesus of Nazareth founded neither a church nor a priesthood, not for men and not for women. Instead, Jesus of Nazareth taught, "But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers." Meanwhile, it is known among theologians that Jesus did not want a church. In October 1999, Professor Herbert Haag wrote the following words to the European Synod of Bishops. However, it is regarded as a reliable result of recent theological and historical research that Jesus did not found any church, and even less thought of a certain constitution for the church. This means that all offices in the present church, particularly the offices of bishop and priest, were not created by Jesus, but by the church itself. And so a power church with a ministerial hierarchy may be Catholic, but Christian it is not. Under the auspices of Catholic, the men's hierarchy has committed the worst crimes during the past centuries. Bloody crusades, murder of indigenous people of conquered countries, torture and murder of dissidents, all the way to sexual crimes on children, and again, the oppression and contempt of women, up to perverse tortures and so-called witch hunts. Isn't all that a shameful abuse of the name of Jesus the Christ?
In conclusion, concerning the urging of Pope Francis for equal rights for women, we may also raise the question, if hardly anyone gets upset when the head of a church utters nice words, but his organization acts totally opposite, has then church hypocrisy already become socially acceptable? Everyone is free and has the right to believe whatever he wishes. But someone who very publicly urges equal rights for women will continue to prove himself a liar as long as he does not lead the way as a good example. But everyone can have his own thoughts regarding this. Dear viewers, dear listeners, we take our leave of you for today. We will be glad if you tune in again next time. Until then, goodbye and greetings in God.